Thank you so much, Iskandar. Good morning to all our participants at the last session of the 2020 Liberalism Conference. To those of you who are keen followers of ideas, I think you might know that we do this conference every year in an attempt to have a more detailed discourse about liberal democracy and liberalism across all spectrums, social, economic, and also political. This year, as we all know, because of the pandemic, we've had to move it online. But thank you for spending your Sunday morning with us. So, and thank you as well to His Excellency for being very candid, very open with the sharing of your thoughts. Okay, so for today's panel is on liberal democracy in the pandemic era. We have three very, very special guests with us. The first is Qyira Yusri, Ibrahim Suffian, and also Dr. Wong Huat, who I will introduce in turn before they speak. Just to give a short background of what this topic entails. I'll just read out some short remarks that I have myself prepared. The victory of the Brexit campaign and Donald Trump in 2016 has been widely seen as the start of the backsliding of liberal democracy around the world. Malaysia seems to have bucked that trend with the unseating of the 60-year-old Barisan National Government back in 2018, which heralded a sense of optimism and hope for the future. Unfortunately, earlier this year, the Sheraton move happened and also COVID-19 landed on our shores, sending a rude shock for many of us who grew up looking forward to 2020 and the vision that was supposed to be fulfilled this year. We meet today at interesting times. The US election results, I think, has just been finalized. The US has a new president and the first vice president who is a woman of color. So we definitely live in interesting times. Although I would say that over, I think, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, due to several factors, the sense of apathy and loss of faith in the liberal democratic order, I think, has infected many places, many countries and communities across the world. Which is why I think our first guest for today, Qyira Yusri, is very appropriate actually to speak on this. So Qyira is the co-founder and education director of Undi 18. Undi 18 is a Malaysian grassroots movement that is spearheaded by a group of young people who successfully lobbied for Parliament to take steps towards amending Article 1191 of the Federal Constitution to reduce the minimum voting age in Malaysia from 21 to 18. From my own knowledge, Qyira can correct me if I'm wrong, but the amendment will come into place, I think, in July next year, and which will see 18-year-olds have the right to vote. So Qyira, I would just like to open the session with a question to you. And you can choose to answer this, but also add any more remarks that you have. You have about 15 minutes. So my question to you is, in your work with young people across Malaysia, do you feel this sense of detachment and apathy amongst young people towards nation building as a whole? Or is it just politicians that young people in Malaysia have had enough of, actually? So over to you, Qyira. You have 15 minutes for this first round.
Thank you so much, Aira, for the introduction. So I think, so actually just to add on to what you mentioned earlier, so the amendment to the Constitution is meant to be gazetted by July 2021. But we don't know what could happen before then. But I really hope that, the government of the day will stay to that promise and ensure that the voting rights of 7.8 million Malaysians will be given when the time comes. So I think in the work that we've done with ranging from children to young adults and even older adults as well, I think there is two sorts of perspective that you can take, right? Whether on the question whether young people care about their country and whether they have the sense of patriotism and nation building, I would say yes, evidenced by the amount of young people that are going into social impact work that you see today. So organizations like Teach for Malaysia, organizations like even Undi 18 like ours, we constantly get people messaging us saying they want to volunteer, they want to take the next step in being an active citizen, they want to contribute back to the country, right? You see young people fundraising for people that they don't know, right? Total strangers in the issues of Sabah. You see so many young Sabahans fundraising because they want to give back to the community, because they see that there are areas that there are gaps that government has failed and they cannot fill that, and they look to themselves to step up and to close that gap when it comes to supporting their own community, their own people. One example I see this is when we organized Parliament Digital this year. As you know, it was in reaction to the Parliament supposedly not being able to sit, yet they could attend a session long enough to hear the King's speech. So for young people, for us and my fellow co-organizers, we felt this was a bit ridiculous, and we wanted to organize and provide a platform for young people. To be very honest, and I don't think I've told this to many people, is that we weren't even sure whether people would attend. We were actually quite worried that there would only be less than 200 people or only 50 people that would be interested, and they would only be from Klang Valley. But to our surprise, over 2 weeks of organizing and also recruiting, we had almost 6,000 plus registration of interest for the event. This clearly shows that there is that thirst and hunger for young Malaysians to have a platform where they can air their grouses, or most importantly, represent their community. I think there's not enough platforms that holistically and authentically offer the opportunity to young Malaysians. I think, of course, there are many programs by the government and even political parties for young Malaysians to step up. But I think for the first time, this was a very unique, non-partisan and also maybe bipartisan, but more important, independent platform for young Malaysians. Of course, in the event itself, there were young members of DAP, UMNO, even PAS. We even had young members of ISMA joining us, right? So you really had representation from all sectors of ideology in Malaysia. But most importantly, everyone came to the event, came to the program as independents. And then on, you can see through their debates and their arguments that they genuinely have love for the country and their community, because we actually wanted them to represent their community. So we had people representing the Orang Asli, people representing OKU community, Sabah and Sarawak was represented, even children was represented when one of our best speakers was 15 years old. So to answer the first part of your question, right, I do think young Malaysians love the country and we do want to give back, and we are inherently nation builders at heart. But the question is, what are the platforms available to them to do so? And I think as Undi 18, we're always trying to think of innovative ways to provide that platform. And we definitely hope to collaborate with institutions like, even think tank research centers or government to create that platform for them, so that we can see more of this talent being nurtured and cultivated down the line, so that in time, we would also hopefully have better or really good politicians. But to answer the second part of your question, that what do they see in politics, and whether they feel frustrated and whether there is a sense of apathy, of course, maybe Ben will come with the data and the statistics later, but I think just through conversations of my students and the kids I work with, there is that huge sense of frustration. And I think this primarily comes from a place where they don't understand what is going on and why these are happening, right? So I think a lot of the negotiating, the power grabbing, these are all happening without engagement of the rakyat, right? And I think for young people, and especially if you're below 21 years old and you never voted, or if you're a first-time voter, there's all these questions that will come up, like, then what's the point of voting? Right? Most of the times we tell kids that, the reason why Malaysia is a great country is because we're a democracy and you can choose your leaders, or at the very least choose who represent you. But then you see all of this happening, and His Excellency was right. And technically it is a legitimate government. Technically it is a legal way to come into power. But what does it signal to the future generation? Right? And what does it signal to our kids, our children, that, through negotiations and through dealings and trades, you can change prime ministers, right? This is definitely, I don't think this is definitely the best way to communicate how democracy works to the next generation. So I'm worried that by the time the next general election, or if a snap election is called, that the youth turnout rate might be lower, purely because we have lost faith in the system, especially riding on such a monumental change that happened in 2018. So while I can't conclusively say whether young people are feeling apathetic, but I do feel that sense of frustration and disappointment from young people towards the leaders that we elected, no matter which side they are from. at the moment, because even now you see, even the current opposition are I mean, before this parliamentary session, right? Of course, when Dato' Sri Anwar Ibrahim was coming up with saying, I have the numbers, this of course involves negotiation and dealings as well. And I think that young people who are able to see the bigger picture are asking again, like, what is the difference then? Because then you are using the exact same method that you were criticizing just a few months ago.
Thank you. Thanks, Kira. There's still a few minutes for you, so I would like to have a follow-up question actually. So when you say that there is this clear sense of frustration amongst our young people on sort of the dealings and how politicians sort of do things out of their own interests rather than for the nation. Um, where do you see these young people then channeling that, or rather that platform? Is it through party politics? Because that is definitely a way, right? You can then go ahead and join a political party or form your own political party, or do they see civil society and like civic movements as a better way? Do you see a difference?
I think the difference would be probably what are the exposure of these young people, right? I mean, I think we can safely say that many civil societies, organizations are set up when we have reached the level of awareness that we want to start a movement of our own, right? And then to get to that point, we have to admit there is a certain amount of privilege that you're able to be at a level of self-awareness, because you can think big picture and be like, okay, I need to do something about this, and if I have the resources, I'm going to do something about this. Things like volunteering, organizing, these are all are not every young person will have this privilege, right? I think especially in the context of the pandemic, many young people are losing their jobs, and then we also go into, and then we don't even need to talk about that when you can, sorry, we don't even need to uh, 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 look at them to see, okay, actually, what are you going to do about politics when people are losing their jobs, losing their sanity, losing their lives because of the pandemic? So I think it really depends where you are. From my just my perception, even looking at the participants in Parliament Digital, right? Because for the first time, we have we have one Malaysian youth representing each constituency in Malaysia. So it's very interesting to see the makeup and what their thoughts are. So you can see that young people in beyond the Klang Valley, a lot more keen on joining political parties is what we notice, because I also believe that political parties have the most access to communities and to rural areas because they have the money, right? Either through election campaigning or either when they're government or not government, they have the money, and many CSOs don't have this access when we want to go into different communities. So I think what I noticed is that young people from urban areas or suburban areas are more keen to join CSOs. But beyond that, I see a huge spike in young people interested to join political parties. I think even when Muda was announced like a few weeks ago, you see a lot of young people trying to anchor Muda as a third option, right? Because they see it as an alternative beyond what is currently available. Whether they are or they are not, I think that's up to Muda to decide down the line. But I think for young people, we are looking for options that we can align ourselves with. And I think because of how our political system is set up, many of us believe that political parties are one of the better ways or fastest ways to influence change within the existing politicians that are representing us. Whether this is right or wrong, I think it's up to the individual to decide. But I think these are the options that are available. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting on your observation that how youth in the urban and suburban areas maybe see CSOs as a better channel to affect change, right? We still have a bit of time, so I would like to actually ask you about your Undi 18's latest initiative, which I think is super interesting, which is a simulation of the much talked about local council elections. So working in the CSO sector, we have talked about LCE for the longest time. They obviously haven't been implemented. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about this initiative and why do you feel it's critical to deepen Malaysia's democracy?
Yeah, sure. I think so I think the idea of pushing for LC is definitely not new. Undi Eating didn't come up with it, right? Like Bersih, the OG or CSO has pushed for LCE for years. And we know, Tindak Malaysia has been also championing it. And so what for Undi 18 we wanted to discuss about how do we make this messaging and this cause relevant and important for young people, because the issues of issues like of equal votes falls into certain problems, right? Gerrymandering, malapportionment, local council elections, local issues. And we realized that I think these are very technical terms that young people may not understand, especially if you look at below 21 years old. Even adults will find it very challenging to understand if you're not very familiar with electoral reform work. So we had this challenge, okay, how do we, similar to Undi 18, how do we make this something palatable for young Malaysians out there? And then learning from the success of Parliament Digital, we realized that, instead of, it's not enough to just educate and to put out content to educate the country or young people about the issue. Let's just do it. Maybe it's because we're young and we have less at stake, I don't know, but we just feel like, with Parliament Digital, what we learn is we just do it, and then we show people that it's possible. So this is where the campaign idea of Undi Saksama came from. This was launched after the Undi 18 was passed last year. We wanted to create multiple platforms for young Malaysians, and Undi Saksama is one of them. So through Undi Saksama, we are planning an event called Undi Ketiga, and it's going to be a digital simulation of local council election. Why digital? Because it is the pandemic. We are trying to propose an end-to-end process where people can register as voters, people can vote, people can run as candidates, and then once they are elected as candidates, they will be sitting in a local council meeting, and they will be debating and discussing issues with our own mayor, with the host and everything. And along the way, for the candidates, we will also prepare workshops and sessions with them, with actual councillors and aduns, so that they can understand what does it mean to represent community at a local level, and how do you run these debates or discussions? Because with Parliament Digital, you look at national policies and national issues, but it's a very different context when it comes to local issues and local problems, right? So for us at Undi Saksama today, even though federal and state governments are elected by the people, Malaysians do not have the right to choose their local council representatives. So this power is instead held in the hands of state government. So in line with democratic principles that Undi 18 have been championing, we believe that Malaysians must be returned to their third vote, the right to elect representatives to local councils. So we realized that also, when you look at other countries, for example, maybe not AOC per se, but many other young leaders, they rose up through local politics and local government politics, right? It's very rare, I think, for Malaysians to, I think one of the barriers for youth representation at a national level is because we don't have local council elections, right? So kalau you nak represent, you nak jadi wakil rakyat, terus is adun or MP, right? And then honestly, how many Syed Saddiq can there be in Malaysia, right? Not many of us would have the chance or opportunity to be mentored by a senior politician. One of the parties that do this really well, however, is DAP, right? Many of their aduns have started from local councillors. So you really put the meaning of, politik rakyat into their leadership structure, or into their training structure, leadership development structure within their own party. But this is a party's initiative. How do we ensure that every single politician, how can we have faith in all of them that, you will represent us, because you know what it's like to deal with the regular people? And not to mention, it's a great first job to have if you want to go into politics. So I think we also can prevent like young career politicians that's often being thrown around at the young people when they say that, oh, you actually don't know what you're talking about. So I think when we encourage young people to become elected representatives at the local level, you'll see a lot. I think you'll slowly see more competent politicians down the line. So despite local council's central role in governance, especially in the states, we realize that most young people have a very limited understanding of local councils as well, and are unable to conceptualize how local councils function or fit into existing systems of governance. This also comes from a lack of political literacy. When you see KL, I see KL youth would tweet Fahmi Fadzil to, hey, my longkang rosak, or the tree fell down, and then he's very patient at replying everyone and say, oh, actually you don't call me, you need to call DBKL, and things like that. And then so I think this, hopefully through these initiatives, we want to encourage and educate Malaysians what are different levels of governance and government structure that we have here in Malaysia. And besides just doing infographics and articles and videos, organizing an event like this where young people can actively participate is another way of I think one of the innovations in voter education is what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you so much, Qyira. That was really excellent, and I think all the initiatives that you have mentioned is is really key to this robust liberal democracy that we are all aspiring to. Voter education and involvement of young people, I think, are really real bedrocks of our liberal democracy. So thank you. We will come back to you later in the session. So now I would like to invite Ibrahim Suffian, who is I don't think he's a stranger to all of us here. He's the co-founder and program director for Merdeka Center for Opinion Research, which is the leading public opinion polling and political survey organization in Malaysia. He has worked in many other countries: Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Brunei, Singapore, and Myanmar, and is a frequent political commentator in Malaysia and also internationally. So Ben, you have the floor. I think you have a presentation for us. So I would let you go ahead with the presentation, and I will follow up with questions if we have time. So please go ahead, Ben. You have 15 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Qyira, and thanks, Ideas, for organizing this, very important and timely conference. And indeed, it's a pleasure for me to be able to speak at this event and share some of the information. I think before I go into the presentation itself, I just want to say that, liberalism as an idea is something that, many Malaysians, retain relatively low awareness, perhaps in terms of how we are orientated. We are very domestic looking in terms of the political ideologies that are being sold to us as voters, as consumers of the information, and as well as ordinary citizens. And I think of late, perhaps in the last 2 to 5 years, there has been a kind of narrative that's being put across, perhaps arising from the internal contestation in politics in Malaysia as well, to demarcate what constitutes liberalism, and therefore to try and typecast liberalism or even vilify it as an ideology. So we have done some surveys related to this topic. In fact, we've been tracking this year on year, and I'll share some snippets from the survey. At the same time, I think the sentiments that we see expressed in Malaysian politics right now has always been strongly influenced by our communal societal experiences. And so when we look at liberal democracy, we tend to see it not in terms of not only in terms of the potentials it brings, but more often our leaders, many of which who may not completely agree with what liberal democracy means, also tend to hype up, tends to lend too much weight in terms of the pitfalls of liberal democracy, and therefore sometimes it raises artificial expectations on many Malaysians in terms of how politics ought to act. This narrative building, along with our cultural experiences as a society, colors the way we interpret things and colors the way we expect politicians to behave, and also politics as well. I mean, in our surveys that we've done with many Malaysians, including young people, there is a clear, distinct distaste for politics. In a recent survey we did, just early this year, we found that many young people, particularly, distrust politicians. In a survey we did prior to the 2018 general election, we did it in I think late 2017, we found that many people felt that politics is a bad thing. And I think this is where this narrative needs to be corrected, needs to be contested, that politics itself is nothing good or bad. Politics is a way to find solutions for our problems. But the problem is that many of the leaders that are championing politics, that are active in politics, sometimes do not take the trouble to empathize, do not take the trouble to educate, but more critically, do not take the trouble to show good role leadership, in what it means to be a Malaysian, what it means to be a moral and ethical person. And so it is very easy to speak to the gallery. So, beyond this preaching, let me share my screen here and just show you what we found in a survey we did last year. Let me move this. We've been doing survey year on year on Malaysian attitudes towards liberalism. So our next round is going to be sometime later this month. But I just wanted to share you that, when we ask people whether they've heard about liberalism, just about one half of people has heard about liberalism. In 2018, we had 61% people heard about liberalism. And at the time when we did the survey, it was very close to the rallies or demonstrations contesting the government of that day, the PH government of that day's intention to ratify the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So there's a lot of outpouring of criticism that this is a liberal agenda, that the liberal agenda is not in line with Islam, not in line with the values of our country. So a lot of times the views about liberalism tends to be negative. And what we do understand is that for many people, they don't understand what liberal democracy or liberalism means. And so when we talk about classical liberalism, we're just talking to a very small group, just 20% of Malaysians who claim they understand. We don't even know what exactly they understand. It could be, wrong views about liberalism. And when we ask people what they feel about liberalism, nearly one half of the Malaysian public, doesn't really have a view about it. They don't understand. And a lot of times, some of them just talk about, just general social freedoms and so on, the freedom of speech. And only small numbers talk about, the freedom of choices, religious freedom, and things like that. So you do have a small sliver of society that feels that liberalism is anathema to Islam. So we also have such views. And whether it is a good or bad concept for Malaysians, this is an interesting topic. Only 20% of the people answered in the positive, 32% answered in the negative. So you do know that large numbers of the population do not understand it. But when we peel away that first layer, the superficial layer of ethnicity, of culture, we do notice this big dichotomy between Malay Muslims and non-Malay non-Muslims. Very stark difference in terms of what they understand. So it's clear that in terms of trying to make people understand, not about liberalism as an ideology or as a concept, but more about the principles it stands for, about democracy, about the importance of civil liberties, and so on. Many people, still don't appreciate it. I mean, there's going to be reasons for that, and I would be willing to discuss that further in other parts of this conversation with all of you, because we do try to understand, what makes Malaysians tick. Why do they behave or believe the way they do? And we are, by nature, the product of our culture, the product of our nature, as well as the kind of daily consumption of news and experiences that each individual Malaysians feel. And that colors our view about politics, about society, and importantly, democracy and how it's supposed to be practiced in Malaysia. So I'm going to end this slide here, but I just wanted to conclude some of my points that when we look about the future of democracy in this country, where things have not really seen as being ideological or policy oriented, that it tends to be personality-centered. We've just come out from an election, an important election in the state of Sabah, where ultimately it's about the leaders that these political parties represent and not specifically about their policies or their agendas. I think we need to understand why that is the case. And superficially, I can offer maybe a view that our society, you know, is a society that is divided across competing interests around communities, along regions, along age groups, as well as along economic classes. And within it are players and actors that are trying to mobilize, trying to persuade us to believe in one thing or the other. But underpinning all of that is our culture and our, our traditional beliefs, where we come from a fairly conservative society. We are Asian society, and therefore we tend to reflect, and this is not just in Malaysia, but across the Southeast Asian and East Asian region as well, strong idea on being collective, acting on the interests of the wider group or community as opposed to that of the individual. So a lot of times, politicians use this narrative that for the greater good, you must sacrifice your personal freedoms. For the greater good, you need to give up that allocation of the budget so that some other element within government have access to that. So we have always been talked to this way. And this has influenced the way we look at the role of politics and also the role of leaders. And my view is that in order for the agenda to step forward, in order for groups like Undi 18 and other young people to be successful in championing their interests, particularly for the next generation of Malaysians, we need to have a greater willingness to be open. But we also need more courageous, authentic leaders that's willing to challenge some of these long-standing notions about collectivism, many of which has been, subverted to support, personal or very narrow agendas. The so-called Bumi Putra agenda and others have many ways been used to further the interests of certain groups. And there has not been enough voices to counter that. I think we need more plurality in politics so that these ideas can be discussed freely and that people can decide for themselves. I think the platforms for people to be educated and informed of politics is increasing out there. The cost of getting information across has gone down. The stranglehold that people in power used to have on the media, that's broken down as well. So media has fragmented, and likewise, it has opened up channels for people to communicate. So what really remains is authenticity, passion, as well as informed leadership who can take up the challenge. And also to think long term, that this is not something to be done just for the next election. It has to be generational, in order for us to see success and to see change take place in a durable and enduring way in our society. Let me just stop there. And, Aira, if you have any points you want to raise, you can begin with that.
All right, thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your survey as well. I mean, I know that it's something that Merdeka Center does every year, but also I just wanted to just a bit more time, but I just wanted to maybe just get a short comment from you about because what you said, what you showed in the survey, and your comments about personality-centered politics is actually quite related, because I feel like the divide between, say, liberalism or socialism is not really the battle lines in which Malaysian politics is fought. It's fought on different battle lines. Race and religion is the obvious one, but also a sense of whether my right as an individual versus my community. So yeah, I mean, do you see that middle sort of being pushed a little towards a more sort of ideological spectrum in our politics? Yeah.
I think that's an important question. I think society is changing, and at the same time, society is not homogeneous. We have, wide-ranging number of people with different ideas in society, and I think what really is present now is this access for people to speak up and share. But I think what also remains, I think this is, goes on, people can speak, but then, whether they have the freedom after speaking, it's often the issue that civil society raises in Malaysia. Then you get hauled up, you get stuck in, the legal process for saying something wrong towards someone. But I think the reality is that the opportunities and the avenues for people to express themselves exist. And also there is a shift in terms of society, in the sense that in the past, we've had a very strong central government, and this central government has, basically dominated public life for many decades. The situation has broken down now, in the sense that there no longer is a strong central government. They do have levers over power, but people's interests, I think, come forward. The political arena has become very competitive, that politicians really have to perform. More so that we see, what has unfolded since March this year. I know many people are upset over how things have transpired, but at the same time, you also have to look at the flip side. The standing government only has a 2-seat majority. So they really have to perform and try their best to fulfill the public agenda if they are to retain any semblance of support moving forward. At the same time, they also have to, I think, begin to be flexible, that the ideologies that they hold alone, wanting to have a strong Malay Muslim agenda, that alone may not save them. So there is a need to be flexible and reach out to other partners across the aisle, and therefore have the courage to walk away from, the standard chess pieces of the Malaysian political arena. So my final point, basically on that, is that for young people in this country, the old rhetoric about government track record, about patronage politics, about the patriarchal system, how we have to call our politicians Abba, Pak Long, Pak Su, and all that. I think eventually we have to walk away from that, because ultimately these are living being individuals who need sustenance, who need to find livelihoods. Ultimately, the government has to be effective, and they will be judged on their effectiveness in delivering good services to the public. So it won't be long that they will be tested, and the public is going to demand responses from them. And this pandemic, I think, has accelerated that process, because we have an economic crisis, we have a healthcare crisis, and we don't know how long these things will go for, and the impact will be felt throughout society.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim Suffian, for very useful and insightful remarks. I think that we can come back on later. Now I'm going to go to the third panelist for this session, Professor Wong Huat, very well-known political scientist. He is with the Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development. He has been a long-term advocate of electoral reforms through Bersih, and he is also a key member of the Electoral Reforms Committee. So, Prof. Wong Huat, I think you have a presentation as well. So I will just give the floor to you. You have 15 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Aira. I'll continue with where our conversation has gone. I basically will touch on two things, mainly on democracy and division, because a lot of people love democracy but fear division. And the second thing is on women representation. However, if I have more time, I would touch a little bit on the new normals. So get back to the pandemic. What is important here is that people should see, when we think about party, the words come from actually parts. This is a standard scene in the Westminster Parliament. And you see the parliamentarians are sitting apart because they represent part of the population. They don't represent the whole. And between them, both on the government bench and the opposition bench, you have the division between the front benchers and the back benchers. So again, the whole idea is based on division. I'll come more to that. But for people who think about, say, we want a country that is fully united, there's no politicking, my suggestion is that you should queue up at the North Korean embassy to ask about immigration. Now, it's time for us to unlearn our fear of division. And this goes back to this guru of even liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who say free institutions are next to impossible in a country make up of different nationalities among a people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages. The united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government cannot exist. The influences which form opinions and decide political acts are different in the different sections of the country. And altogether different set of leaders have the confidence of one part of the country and of another. The same books, newspaper, pamphlets, speeches do not reach them. So there are plenty more reasons for us to fear, because even today you read the same material in the same language. You read the same language, you do not read the same materials. And that's why the Americans, whites, Americans are divided. Even most of them are English speaking. And so are Malays in Malaysia. But the fear for division go back before this. It comes from something that is much more pre-modern. The idea that united we stand and divided we fall. And that makes sense. This is a picture I plucked from ISMA, the far-right group in Malaysia. This talks about that the fall of the Islamic Empire in Spain, in Andalusia. And why? Because that Muslims are not united, therefore they eventually surrender themselves to the Christians, and they were forced to abandon their faiths and so on. Now, you can find plenty of reason that when you are divided, then you stand a good chance to be defeated. And because most of the battles in human history, you never really have the loser completely united. There are often some frictions here and there. So if you want to pick and argue and say we need to be united to win, there are plenty of reasons that why you need to do so. It goes back to the time when our ancestors lived as hunterers, gatherers. It's a simple idea that if we put our head and mind together, then you actually get to get to win. But if you split among yourself, then you lose. Now, this goes back to the earlier discussions by His Excellency Gozinowski on the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. Democracy, in one sense, is one that actually appreciates or has to appreciate division, because all political systems would have to deal with three kinds of threats. Anarchy or chaos, the first. The second, external threats, whether it's human or non-human. The third is internal threat. By internal threats, I refer to not about internal division, but rather the betrayal of elites. That means you get betrayed by people you're supposed to trust. In management study, this is called principal agent problem, that company manager prefer to spend more to expand the country, to go for maximum revenue instead of maximum profit, because he can actually draw a larger salary. In Malay proverb, that's very simple. Harapkan pega, pega makan padi. Counting on the pheasant to protect the paddies, and the peasants ended up eats the paddy. So how do you deal with this? How do you actually stop being a victim of the pheasant, the pega? Simple solution is that you need to have more than one pheasant. Because if you count one pheasant, and pheasant is the only way you can control the pest, because you do not use pesticide and so on, then the only way is to have more than one pheasant so that you can kick one out if this pheasant has gone too far and still in eating the paddies. And the other reason why division is important is ultimately it provides us choices. And we talk about this, that when the country moves from left to right and so on, this is a situation where society actually adjusts collectively. What do they need? If a society is very right-wing, talking about free market and so on, then you would see the disparity in wealth and income growing. And to a point that people will say that's too much, they would bring down the government and bring in a central left government or leftist government. So to talk more about redistribution, the price of that, of course, is economic growth will slow down. At some point later, people will say, I want to go back to free market again. So what we talk about division here is really choices and adjustment. To have everyone united on something similar is dangerous. Imagine that what happened if our hypermarkets, Mydin, Giant, Tesco, Aeon, all decide to say we want to get united at this time of pandemic to serve the consumer better. The consumer would end up losing everything because there no longer be any sale. How to make division work? First thing is that we actually need to reorganize a society that we have cleavages. The divisions that are actually spread out, they are cross-cutting instead of reinforcing. What does it mean? If everyone, you can tell one person who would be in the same socioeconomic class, believe in the same God, speak the same language, then it is hard for people of different class or religions or language not to fight each other in a do or die manner because your interest is so well aligned. However, if you actually all these categories cut it off among themselves, then you will work with someone of your same class to fight someone else. The next day, you fight over language, and the third day you fight over religions. You do not have permanent friends and enemies, and that actually makes democracy work. So we need more divisions, not less. The second question here is that how do you actually get you get good politics, whether for divisions to work? By definition, parties are electoral machine. Parties in democracy, in multi-party democracies, are electoral machines. But how are they also policy machine? Meaning that do they actually compete by giving us coherent choices in policy? And at the end of the day, if they do not win a majority, can they actually forge reasonable and meaningful compromises? These are questions that we need to ask. There's no simple questions that guarantee that say division would work, but without division, there can be no modern democracy as we understand it. The second part I want to touch on is women representations and electoral system. This is the figure as updated as last month. If you look at countries with elected national parliament, in the case where they have 2 chambers, these are those from lower chambers. Look at them from 1 up to 20. Most of the countries either have least PR or least PR as part of the system, namely a mixed system, mixed member system. And the two outliers, one is Cuba. They have a 2-round system. And the second one is Grenada, first past the post like ours. Why? Before we go to that, let's look at where does Malaysia stand. Malaysia stands at 140 out of 190 over countries. Because only 1 in every 7 MPs is a woman. And where do we stand in the rest of the world? We are next to countries like Bhutan and Gabon and Brazil, Bahrain, Jordan, Chad, Thailand, and Russia. The situation is worse for most of the states. These are the numbers you can see. You can see that the numbers actually here are very low. People talk about 30%, the minimum 30% women representations in the House. Since 1995, the Beijing declarations and platform for actions, but none in the Malaysian state has achieved that. The best is actually Police, 27%, Selangor, 21%, and Johor, 16%. Why? Simple reason is because under our first past the post system, you have only 1 seat per constituency. So when you want to put 30% women in, you basically need to replace some of the men. But the stronger men would not want to give up their seats so easily. They would agree with you and say, please try my neighbor. I think he should retire, not me. If you get to replace some weaker man, that's probably a dangerous constituency that you don't stand a chance to win. Even you have 30% candidate, that does not give you 30% outcome. So it's very simple, and also because the system allowed incumbent, because it's single person, it built personal personal votes, and therefore it allowed the incumbent to tell the party and say, you do not put me, put someone else, you're going to lose the seat. So, and no parties would go so far to say, well, we're going to take the risk just to have more women. The simple solution is actually to change it with, first of all, a multi-member constituency. If you have a system of multi-member constituency, then it's very easy for you to put some women. And there's one question that was raised by a friend just now for His Excellency is on Singapore. Singapore system is actually a multiple constituency, the group representation constituency. And the idea is to protect minority representation. But the outcome of that is that even there's no law demanding it, every constituency would have at least one women candidates, because it makes no sense for you to have an all-male panel. And how does it work? If you want to make sure it works, you cannot count the party to actually place it there. A better way than Singapore is actually have proportional representation, party list proportional representation, meaning that you have constituency that with a lot of names. Let's say if it's a first past post on the left, you see there are 12 constituency. But now, if we're going to create this into a PR system, we probably have also 12 seats in one single constituency or 8. And then you can actually make the law to demand the parties to nominate certain numbers of men and women. So it can be 50-50, or it can be 1 out of 3. It has to be at least a woman and so on. And this is called placements rule. And you can actually ensure the outcome. If you have any questions, I'll go later into the details. But before we change this, now to change the electoral system to something with multiple member constituency, you need to amend Article 116 for the Federal Parliament, Article 117 for the State Assembly. So you can't even do that for the states. But it is not to say that you have no option. This is a this is a solution that has been proposed to the Penang state government and is being seriously considered. If cross our finger, we may see this at the end of next year. The idea is to actually have top-up seats. So if you don't have enough women in the legislature, we just add women until eventually you get to the number of 30%. I'll go into details again if you have more questions. This is currently what you have in Penang. Sorry, this is currently what you have. 6 out of 40 is only 15%. So in order for you to have 30%, you need to add 9. So it will be 15 out of 49. So that's a simple idea to explain what it is. Now, I would have, how much time I have? Aira?
1 more minute, Huat.
Sure. Okay, I'll talk about the new normals. People are used to the old idea that you have a majority government. No, that's going to be gone at least for some time to come. Why? Because Sabah and Sarawak and Labuan, they hold together among themselves 57 seats. And whoever on these parties, except a few from DAP, are not going to play by Malaya until they have a simple majority there. So meaning that this party would actually negotiate for the maximum gain. For that reason, for a simple majority government to appear, one coalition would need to win up to perhaps 112 out of 165 seats in the peninsula, which is almost impossible. Why? Because the opposition, whoever on that side, is unlikely going to win only as little as 53 seats. Second, for that reason, of what we have seen and what has been alluded by His Excellency, we no longer have permanent coalitions because it is replaced by post-election coalitions. You can actually change this. We need to get used to what happened in February. I know that it's very traumatizing for many people because we get used to say, this is who we vote will actually appear in the government, but this is unlikely the case. Next election, you probably see UMNO and Bersatu fighting against each other because they are probably the strongest party in the Malay constituency. And maybe they might even be joined by PAS if PAS is big enough. And what makes people feel so angry is that they're seeing bad politics now, because you cannot control, you cannot hold your parliamentarians accountable. When the government is weak, you end up, whatever attempt to change the government merely create more minister and give more lucrative jobs in the government-linked companies, which was discussed yesterday. So what's the solution? The simple solutions that a lot of people will say is that no politics. This is pandemic time. Let's put aside politics. You know, you can fight after we get over with this pandemic. For now, could you just stay out of it? Now, what does it really mean? It really just means that, say, you want dictatorship. Because politics, as we understand, is their administration, is that you have people voice out what they want and they have to find a solution. But you say you do not want politics. You basically say, I prefer someone just to make a decision for me so I don't have to worry. Now, the alternative to that is professional politics. How do we get politicians to act like professional? Like, what would you expect of doctors, of lawyers, of architects, of accountants, of teachers, of journalists? So I'll stop here because I probably have overrun, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Huat. I feel like every time, yes, please, thank you. I feel like every time I listen to Huat, I'm sitting in the political science class that I never took. So, so it's always such a pleasure to listen to Huat. I'm just going to read off some questions from the Q&A box. The first one, actually, I'm going to go back to Qyira, which is by a question by Yi Chao Boy. So the question is, on a local community level, how best can we, and the we is older people, parents and community leaders, engage with youth to guide their narratives of liberalism in a constructive and open manner? And furthermore, now there are so many competing channels of information. So Qyira, maybe you would like to take that question?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe I'm the only youth on this panel to address this question. But my response to that is that, first of all, in my experience of not just being still in the category of youth, but also I actively work with kids and teenagers, is that first, we cannot sugarcoat the problems when we want to talk to them, right? We cannot assume that just because they are younger, that they know less, or they're not going to understand what I'm trying to say. I think, so first of all, that's that, right? So we cannot assume that they are not ready to have these conversations. One of the assumptions that the older generation, and I think it's especially prominent among the educators, that we assume that young people are not able to comprehend difficult concepts or theories. So how do we, introduce these ideas and a concept to them? So when you look at what is the core idea of liberalism, it's freedom. One way is that, you reduce government intervention into our lives and into economics. So I think, so how do we talk about this topic to kids, first of all, right? So maybe one of the ways to make young Malaysians or teenagers appreciate liberalism more is to start with the basics of wanting to have more control of their own lives. Can we talk to them about, the decisions that are made for them, such as education, employment, welfare? These are all policies and decisions are made on behalf of them. And then I think for many young Malaysians, we don't realize that we don't have the agency in our own lives. So I think if we want to start having these conversations, then we need to start. If we want to expose to them these concepts, then these are the beginner conversations that we can have with young people.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Qyira. I would like to read out a question here by Sun Hop, because I think it relates to the last point that Chin Huat was making in his presentation. So Dr. Wong Chin Huat highlights that division works. No absolute unity government is necessary, but more of a credible opposition. The only problem is, how do we prevent them from landing in jails? I assume them is the opposition. When they are doing credible check and balance, they say free speech, but no more free after speech, unless the majority of silent voters wake up and not fear disunity. Chin Huat, maybe you want to take that one?
Sure. The key point here is that we need to make sure that a state to be in opposition, and not just only free from jail, imprisonment, but also that it doesn't turn out to be, you don't find yourself end up in uselessness. To start the first question, how do you prevent selective prosecution? We need to dismember the Attorney General Chambers too. Keep the AGC as mainly as the legal counsel to the government, and the AG himself can be a parliamentarian, and then you establish an independent public prosecutor office. This is what we need to do, and this is the price that PH paid for not taking this seriously as a key point. PH talk a lot about institutional reform. Often they are looking at it from good governance. They do not think about how do you actually sell this for your own survival. If you're looking at your own survival and you do not assume that you're going to last long, then a separations of public prosecution office from the agency should be one of the top priority. But this was promised only in words. There was no clear idea. And you want to go beyond that, we need the opposition not to see themselves as wasting their time, because now really that if you're in opposition, you basically have no power. Parliament does not perform as a check and balance institutions. This is something we need to understand. It's not just because of Mahathir. It's because that is how parliamentarian system work. Can I share my slide just very quickly?
Yes, please, go ahead.
This is actually just how our system works. Under a parliamentarian system, under a parliamentary system, the parliament first function is actually to work as an electoral college, and then only making laws. Making law is actually more of an AGC works, unless you have a lot of select committees and private member bills, and then scrutinizing government, approving budget, and so on. So until you reach to that point, if you have a very simple, a very united, a very solid single party government, Parliament cannot function anywhere because it would not be able to do any of these things to check on the government. Ultimately, when we think about Parliament, we should think about three parts: that you have the government front bench, the government back bench, and the opposition. To empower the Parliament here, we should empower the opposition and also the government backbenchers so that they could actually check. And this is all about, we need to talk about other than the AGC reform. We need to have parliamentary reform. We need to have equal fundings to constituency and so on. And this is what we are glad that some of our opposition parties are now championing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Huat. There's one question here from Jordan Tan, which I would like to direct to Ben, and then maybe Huat can also contribute if you want. But I think this is an interesting question. So Jordan Tan says that there are two professions which does not need training of any kind, which is the oldest profession, and also being a politician. So why can't this country have some minimum qualification for anyone who seeks public office? And I think this touches upon this question of why is it that there is no good people in politics, and why is it that when people get into politics, they just cannot do good things, right? So Ben, do you want to answer this question, please?
Thank you so much. I'll take a stab at it. I think number one, I fundamentally disagree about having some kind of minimum educational requirements for people to stand and contest in politics, because I think it undermines the whole democratic spirit and the whole freedoms that people have for the right to vote as well as the right to contest in elections. Because once someone does that, if let's say you put a limitation that you need to have a basic degree before you can contest, then it just precludes, maybe 2/3 of our population from ever being eligible. Whereas I think, important characteristics of being a good politician is someone that is, understands the grasp of the issues, understands, how the system works, at the same time able to communicate and able to get the job done, and understands the legislative process and so on. The rest, I think, of what a politician needs to do is going to be supplemented by the people they hire, the experts and the staffers that they're going to hire to aid them in their day-to-day duties. So, so I think educational qualification alone is not sufficient in order for us to have good politicians. I think what's needed is a strong check and balance system, freedom in the media. When I say freedom in the media, it's not just about, I saw some of the earlier comments about media ownership. I think there's no problem about having media owners that are linked to certain political parties. What's I think fundamental is for anyone who intends to have to operate a media operation or media company needs to have the freedom to do so within the limits of the law, meaning they cannot engage in hate speech, they cannot portray falsehoods and things like that. So I think there has to be ethics governing media, and perhaps it's peer reviewed ethics in terms of media. So you need check and balances in that area. You also need check balances in the institutions, whether it's the judiciary or the other enforcement institutions that are in the country. So where we are in Malaysia, I think the challenge, and I think Pakatan Harapan back in 2018 was just in the initial stages of trying to implement this, was trying to make some of these institutions more independent, i.e. report to Parliament as opposed to report to the Prime Minister's department or some ministry, such as the selection of judges, the anti-corruption agency, having an independent police commission that reports to Parliament, things like that. So you need check and balances. So at the end of the day, the leadership that comes out, people probably will have the basic intelligence to do these things, but I think what distinguishes good from bad politicians are those that use the power they have in their hands to solve problems rather than intensify them or create more divisions in an already very contested society that we have here.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to add on that. There's another question about by Kot Lily about professional politics, which Huat touched upon, right? So, building on the question to Ben earlier, which is, if you put certain academic qualifications, then that sort of acts as a barrier actually for people to enter politics. But then, Huat, going back to your point on the professionalization of politics, you have said, I think in one of your previous presentations, that there is a hardware and a software to, ensuring that our politics becomes better. Could you explain a bit more what you mean by this hardware and this software?
Well, okay, I'll go back to earlier questions. I completely agree with Ben that we should not have any pre-requirement other than you are of sound mind, you pass the age of majority. Why? Because to have any other qualification would be arbitrary. How do we draw the line? How do you tell that someone is actually moral and clean and so on if and do you want to sort of like tell them and say you cannot be too rich, you can't get well? No, that is not only an infringement of their property right, but more than that, you probably are distorting all the incentive. What we really need is to turn politics into an honorable profession, just like any other professions. As simple as that. When we talk about being professional, it means that you have to have skill. You can't stay in a profession completely and say, well, I'm just likable, even though that interpersonal communication is part of the skill. Second, you need to abide by some ethics. Now, what is so important here is to differentiate between professional ethics and morality. Our society tends to have this idea that we want people to serve the public selflessly. Now, think about how unrealistic this is when you talk to a doctor. Now, you of course, you would appreciate if a doctor do not charge you, with a very heavy bill. But would you ever go to a doctor and say, your job is supposed to save life? How dare you live such a luxurious life? Can't you just live like us? You wouldn't say those things, right? And Very realistically, why do Malaysians parents like to send their kids to learn at medicine? Real reason is because most of the time, not because they want their children to save the world, it's because that the medicine professions bring money, money and prestigious, right? But for any doctor to stay in that line, you need to have your expertise as well as your ethics. And this is what we should demand of. To see how we look at politics. If I'm going to ask you here, can people vote here? If you can, then let's just do a simple experiment. How many of you think that politics is dirty? And how many of you think that it's dangerous? And how many of you think that politics is also difficult? If you have answered yes for all three questions, you basically say politics is a 3D job. Subconsciously, you're thinking that this is a job that I would not want to touch. Let's get some, with due respect for our guest worker, let's get some Indonesians or Myanmaris or whosoever to get it done. And you expect politics to be functional with that, it's not going to work. So to change this, what we really need to do now is actually to have a realistic expectations of politicians. It is okay for them to pursue power. It's okay for them to feel great. The whole point at the end of the day is that do you play by certain rules and do you make sure that your competition would bring about greater goods to the public? That's what we really should ask. We don't need you to be saints and sages. If we need them, we can find them in charities, in churches, in mosques, temple, whatsoever. But we don't need them in politics, in the house. We just need people decent enough to compete. And this is what I go back to say, the competition cannot be just about, say, how many baby you kiss and so on. And ultimately, it's what kind of policy you offer. And if you do not win a majority, what kind of compromises you're going to reach out to your opponents, to your rivals. These are things, what it means by being professional. And until we change this, do not expect politicians will actually become a different species. I believe that the bosses collectively, meaning the voters, are actually much more powerful than the employees, the politicians.
Thank you, Huat. There is also another question in the chat box. I think this is from Oi Kok Hin. So he has two questions. I think this will be directed to Huat, but of course, if Ben or Qyira have any inputs. The first one is probability of electoral reforms by G15, and the second one, how might the PR system affect ethnic outbidding and polarization? While it allows for third parties like Muda and PSM to compete, it may also empower the far right like Berjasa. Huat?
Right. Okay. First question, how likely it is? I go back to say whether our politicians see themselves as gamblers or insurance buyers. As simple as that. Because if you think yourself as gamblers, then all gamblers believe their luck would be good. So you believe that this is a good game, I'll win next time. So there's no reason for you to change because it's a game that actually allowed the winners to take off. But if you assess the situations realistically and ask, well, how sure I know that my luck will be good tomorrow, then probably you want to buy insurance. Insurance is basically an idea that when you're in good days, you part with some of your income in exchange power when in rainy days. So if you go for a fairer system, then when your luck is good, you do not take everything. But when your luck is bad, you do not lose everything. And you want to know what I mean by gambler, look at the US presidential elections. Normal presidential elections, whether it's pluralities of majority, meaning 2 rounds, of course, every would count, but it would not be so much dependent on a few battleground states. The fact that it depends on whether how many votes that would actually flip Pennsylvania's Georgia and so on, that tell you it's a casino. So to what extent we change that again is a problem. If you still do not accept that politics is part of our life to be democratic, and you do not want to demand politicians to change, they would not change. But if this is a public voice, things would change. Groups like Bersih have been talking about reforms, about inter-party agreement. Some of the things have not come about, but confidence is a plight. We say it without exactly mention the term in June. By August, this is already out. Today, people talk about CSA. So these are things that how ideas could actually change. But we need to be more pragmatic. If you cannot think as pragmatic as politicians, do not expect politicians to change, to listen to you, because they look at you and say, well, you're dreamers. And end of the story, they just look down at you. You want to look down at them, you need to be as pragmatic as they are and see their short-sightedness. Back to the question, so how about PR? How do you actually prevent PR from, how do you prevent PR from encouraging ethnic outbidding? Let's put it this way. First past the post itself is already encouraging ethnic outbidding. Otherwise, how do we explain the collapse of PH? What really influence or not influence ethnic outbiddings largely go back to how power is shared in the center and how opposition see themselves. If opposition believe that they have nothing to gain when in opposition, then why should they actually behave responsibly? So the idea for people, for the parties to come together, we need actually the best protection is not PR. It's not prevention of PR, avoidance of PR, but rather how do we create a sensible, responsible behavior, a culture amongst in our political class. Look at New Zealand. New Zealand has a minority, Maori, and they have right-wing party as well. But over time, we see that the parties actually, they do not get very polarized. They were much more diverse than in the old days when they have only two parties. But they did not get very polarized because you actually have a culture that's sink in. And we have people like Jacinda Ardern today. She was a minority government prime minister, and she ran the country well, very stable. It's time for us to learn beyond the UK. And before I end, I just want to say, if you think UK is a first past the post country, remember that only works for the Westminster Parliament and also local authorities elections. For Scotland, for Wales, and for Northern Ireland, for London, it's actually all different system. Their regional assemblies are MMP. Thank you. As in New Zealand.
Thanks, Huat. That's new information for me too. So thanks. There is actually one more question from Trisha, but because we have maybe about 7 to 10 more minutes. So I would just like to be a bit selfish because I have one question for Ben actually that I've been meaning to ask, and also because we have just finished the US elections. Let me just read out my my question to you, Ben, which is you run probably the most famous political polling agency in Malaysia. But when you look at the US elections, much of the fuss has been about how political polling has not been able to reflect electoral outcomes. So what do you actually think is the future of using polls to predict electoral outcomes? Is it still relevant in this era of uncertainty and increasing political fragmentation? Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Aira. Yeah, it's always a very interesting question because whenever there's elections, this question keeps coming up. In fact, today there is another important election in a neighboring country in Myanmar. We were supposed to do some work there. We did some polls in Myanmar ahead of the election 5 years ago. And so our colleagues out there are in the field doing exit polling as we speak. I think polling certainly has issues, and the issues are many. And the issue I think that people always have with polling and polling firms is the accuracy of the polls to predict. I think we will never be able to fully address these problems because society is changing, how they are getting informed and how they express themselves as well is changing. You know, back in the day, you can ask an open-ended question who you're going to vote for, and in depending on the context, you will get a true enough answer. In the context of the region, in this region, Southeast Asia, I think people in our colleagues in Thailand, in Philippines and Indonesia have done a tremendous job in trying to get reasonably accurate readings. That is not the case here. The case here in Malaysia is that many people, and upwards of 25 to sometimes 45% of the people do not wish to declare their political affiliation. And therefore, using polling to predict electoral outcomes in the context like Malaysia is extremely difficult. And therefore, we have not really tried to make any attempts at doing this, recently. Our attempt to try to do that, in the last election also failed miserably because of the attendant challenges. You have a poll with a very limited sample size, and then you want to project your results on the parliamentary system. That simply just doesn't work so well. More so when you have issues of bias, people who are distrustful of the people who are doing the survey, people who do not want to express themselves. They say A, but actually they are voting B. In the context of Malaysia, our experience has been a lot of people do not want to disclose if they are voting opposition. So the opposition vote share in a survey is always extremely low. But and so we try to estimate by looking at different questions. I think how important is it? The importance of the polls is that as inaccurate or as despite the flaws that it has, it is still a useful tool to understand what motivates people, what drives people to make certain kinds of decision. So while you need to accept perhaps a larger margin of error, you can understand the motivations behind it, and then you can begin to develop a plan. How do you persuade people more effectively? How do you reach out to people who may not otherwise like you? So it's still a useful tool, but maybe there are many challenges in trying to predict an outcome, particularly in a situation like what we have in Malaysia, or even in more developed countries like the US or the UK.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ben. Actually, we will need to end real soon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to each of you, starting with Qyira and then Chin Huat and then Ben to give some closing remarks before I end the session. Chin Huat, there's one question from Trisha in the chat box about the Penang Legislative Assembly. She wants to know who actually selects the individuals that will be top up to make the quota. So I think you can take that in your closing remarks. So Qyira, back to you. Just your closing thoughts on the whole topic. So yeah, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think I've personally learned a lot. It's a real honor to be in a panel with Dr. Wong, Chin Huat and Ben. But I think as a young person, I think and running a movement is that I hope that moving forwards, the generational gap and the fear of engaging young people will slowly be closed by having. We need to start by having the difficult conversations. I think the issues of racial politics, the untouchable topics such as affirmative action, where young people are not encouraged to discuss. This needs to begin at we need to tackle this attitude at a much younger age, and that's what we hope to do with Undi 18. Is that how do we get young people to think about policies beyond politics, and how do we also use empathy when it comes to decision making and policy making? This is what we hope to cultivate in the future generation. So I look forward to collaborating with anyone who's interested in this. I think in the work that we do at Undi 18, we're always trying to think of innovative ways to engage young people, and how do we also, again, like I mentioned, integrate empathy. And I think for the fundamental core tenets of liberalism is freedom. Is how do we give the freedom to think and freedom to criticize and the freedom to be themselves in Malaysia, and looking at existing systems, and how do we incorporate these values within those systems. Thank you, Aira.
Thank you. Thanks, Qyira. Chin Huat, over to you.
Right. To answer the questions from Trisha first, this is actually how it works. Let's say that we want to add the seats based on the last election result, and you calculate the percentage of the votes, and then you allocate them proportionately. This is basically a list PR system to put it in, except you bypass Article 117 by not having a direct election. So you count the first past the post vote twice, as in the case now in Thailand. And so if you go by the system, based on the last elections, you would have 9 more members, and Piyush would get 6, BN 2, and PAS would get 1. Now, what would I want to conclude is basically go back on this, that first of all, if we want to move away from ethnic politics, we need healthy division. We need. Did you see my share just now?
No, Chin Huat, I think you'll need to try again.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
No wonder I cannot close it, turn it off. Okay, sorry. Very quickly, I just show this one.
Okay.
Right. So we are here.
Okay, now we can see. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, it's just this one. I'll talk on other points. This is what just for people who are interested. Now, I want to conclude on 2 things. One, if we want to end communal politics, the idea is not about unity. The idea is not to ask people to think like, oh, they're world citizens, they're just Malaysians loving each other. No, we need to be much more pragmatic, deal with human nature. People would want to always compete consciously or subconsciously because we are dealing with limited resources and so on. The idea here is how can we avoid toxic competition? So instead of people arguing that whose God is more powerful, when did your ancestor land on Malaysia, we should have people competing and say, whose policy actually would cater for more? Who would serve my interest better? In other words, we need non-communal division. And for that to come out, you need first past the post. You need to move away from first past the post at least partially. Why? You may have people care about, let's say 10% or 15% Malaysians may care about global warming, but they're not going to be able to stand in any Green Party candidate because they would not move and stay in one single constituency, as simple as that. But if you have list PR, you count their votes with a wider constituency, for example, at the state, then there's a chance they could actually get some people in and your politics change. So that's the first part of what we need to do. And second thing about how do we actually make politics more professional? I want to pour some cold water on people who think that voters are actually against it. The Sabah election showed us this is not the case. There were 18 incumbents from the last assembly who have changed their party from 2018 to 2020. 11 of them won their seats. Most of them 9 of them run under a new party and they won. The 10% actually won as an independent, defeating the old party. What it tells you is that people actually don't care. A lot of people don't care. Why? Because what are lawmakers to them? It's not about lawmaking. It's not about scrutinizing the government. It's about bringing the benefits, the fund back to your constituency. In the American language, the pork barrel. So unless we change this, unless we have parliamentary reform, we are not going to stop all this party hopping, because whoever in government control the money and then they jump over. In Sabah, the difference is as big as 1.1 million. If you are a state minister, it's 2.1 million. If you are an opposition leader, opposition Adun, your constituency still get 1.1 million, but the person who disperse the money will be appointed by the chief minister of your opponent. So you want to survive, you end up make yourself just cheerleaders of the government. This is the problem with our system. If we do not talk about parliamentary reform now, even we get rid of all these frauds in electoral process, nothing would change. We need to make parliamentarian system work before people start thinking of presidentialism as a solution, as an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chin Huat. Ben, your just your concluding remarks, short one, yeah? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we, stand at a very important juncture in Malaysian political history because, if all goes according to plan, by this time next year, we will have many, many millions of young people being able to vote for the first time. And it also comes at the point in time when there's a lot of stresses to the system. We do have, a coalition, a ruling coalition that espouses Malay-Muslim unity. And I think this gives many Malaysian members of the public a first chance to observe whether or not you have this is unified Malay entity can really, deliver the goods or not. And that perhaps by this experience, then people can look into what other things that are on offer out there and can perhaps also entertain what Chin Huat was talking about, more competition in politics. And I think this is where the next generation, the young people in Malaysia, really have an opportunity to shape the future of the country. And the role of, guys like Qyira and her colleagues and others who are working to educate young members of the electorate about the role that they have. The hope is that what happens over the next year or so will educate them and drive them to see beyond the normal narrative and tropes that people use to mobilize popular support, and that at the end of the day, try to get at delivering some solutions to the public, which is policy and so on. And I think here we have a lot of avenues for us to do so. We can see that, just as a short example, the budget 2021 generated quite a lot of discussion online amongst ordinary Malaysians about how it's going to help or hinder them in their daily lives. And so people are engaged in the process in many more ways than they used to before. So there is a lot of role for people who's interested in this arena of political education, political mobilization, to play a strong role in shaping the next election outcome. And the work begins now. Change begins now. We don't have to wait another 2 years, another 6 months. I think it's already happening, and it's up to us to see where things head out there.
Okay, thank you very much to all our three brilliant guests for today, Qyira, Ben Suffian, and also Chin Huat. I think all of us learned so much throughout this session. And I think this is the last session actually of this year's Liberalism Conference. So thank you to all the participants as well for joining us, spending half of your Sunday with us today to learn more about liberal democracy in the era of political and pandemic flight. So thank you so much, everyone.